So which factions won and lost the most out of the recent Warhammer 40k balance update and points changes? Let's talk through each faction in turn and whether they've emerged stronger or weaker after the changes. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about the recent Warhammer 40k balance pass once more, in this one going through each army in the game, talking about where they were in terms of competitive performance before the update, and perhaps whether or not the changes will have a positive, negative impact or not much at all. As 40k balance updates go, I'd say that this one was maybe a medium-sized one. It's certainly not quite as big a change as, say, their half-yearly ones, where they seem to be more keen to make more core changes to Warhammer 40k in general. Not as big as their season change ones, like when Pariah Nexus launched, or the Grotmas ones in December, where every single faction got a new updated detachment as well. But still, there was basically at least some sort of change for literally every single army in Warhammer 40k to a greater or lesser extent. Some armies certainly got a lot more than that though, really big meaningful detachments added in, or a whole bunch of points and datasheet rewrites. I'd say perhaps for a quick summary of the most impactful stuff, Games Workshop really seems to have looked at the detachments that seem to be doing best and trying to limit their impact somewhat. Very focal nerfs to things like Legion of Excess Demons, Guard Bridgehead Strike, Custodes Solar Spearhead and Ork Tactical Brigade, which were all doing rather well previously. It does seem that they've hit the top armies in the game in really quite a big way. The 4 new detachments they've added into the game generally look really quite interesting. It doesn't look like any of them are completely useless at first glance, all landing between somewhere okay to balanced to outright very, very strong for their army. Sisters of Battle in general notably improved a bit, but maybe not as much as people might have liked, and Chaos Demons also had a really big set of changes, with half their army rewritten as a sort of index but codex sort of launch. As mentioned though for this one, let's talk about each faction, roughly where they were doing in terms of tournament performance and win rates and things, and a bit of speculation as to how things might change for them, if at all, going forward. First up, for Core Codex Space Marines, they were one of the armies that got a lot more changes than some. Pre-update they were doing pretty well, tournament win rates are around about 50%, but maybe hiding the fact that Ultramarines were one of the strongest armies in the game and achieving far higher than that. The boys in blue taking down a massive amount of grand tournaments, with them overperforming and then Marines of other chapters generally underperforming compared with that rather balanced win rate. The result seems to have been that Games Workshop wanted to limit the sort of cookie-cutter top Ultramarines lists out there, and that meant that a lot of Space Marine things got points rises, a bunch of really staple firepower things went up, the Vindicator Ballistas and Predator tanks, the common combo of Marnius Calgar and Company Heroes both went up 10 points each, Whirlwinds got nerfed due to indirect fire, and Librarius had a points increase for Fuselage, with those crazy Sternguard veterans deleting most things in the game. There was also a nerf for the combo of Uriel Ventress Deep Striking Devastator Centurions, which had been a staple since the Codex had come out, and that's certainly going to hit Vanguard Spearhead, even if the Centurions did get cheaper. Stormlance's reactive move can't be done on vehicles or Primarchs anymore, maybe Lionel Johnson having a particularly good time with that one previously. The Phobos Lieutenant can't pull off more reliable deep strike charges with Reavers anymore, and Boosted Oath only applies to Core Codex detachments now, not really affecting the actual Core Codex in any way, but a nerf to the weird sort of divergent but not list we had. The only real improvements came from Blade Guard veterans dropping down from 90 points to 80, which I think is significant enough to make them see play. Centurion Devastators improving for most lists unless you were playing with Uriel Ventress, dropping down to 165, and then Gladius Fire Discipline dropping down to 25. Overall, between all that, they've certainly come out worse than before. I'd certainly say they're slight losers of the update, really quite a lot of meta Ultramarine stuff going up. Calgar Company Heroes, Vindicators and Ballistas were all units that were appearing in a massive amount of lists. I don't think it's going to absolutely ruin Space Marine armies though. Guilliman was completely untouched, and he was the other pretty much auto-include staple for Ultramarine armies. I guess more lists will just be building around him, and Space Marines definitely have enough datasheets to fall back on other options, both with alternative gun tanks and various other useful datasheets out there. I guess after this we might see a few less Vanguard lists. Maybe Gladius might be the increasingly popular way to run them. I'm sure we'll be seeing Rabute Guilliman at the heart of a whole bunch of armies still. Despite Calgar going up a bit, I still feel like this isn't exactly the best news for non-Ultramarines players, and Ultramarines still seem to be the way to go given Guilliman. Next up for the Imperial Guard, they'd only had a few weeks worth of tournament data since their Codex release. It looks like they were generally quite balanced overall at win rates of around 49%. Though as their detachments, it was clear that most people were favouring Bridgehead Strike for success in competitive play. That had a much better win rate, much as it had prior to the Codex release. Games Workshop really seemed to have absolutely hammered Bridgehead Strike and Guard Indirects that was being played. Points increases to both the regular Scions and the Command Squad. Bridgehead Strike got changed from a +1 to wound to a +1 to hit, which stacks far worse with orders, given that Scions could be given a 2+ to hit anyway. The Hotshot Lasgun stratagem was a bit worse, and the Bombast Vox Array, which could give you a lot of orders on a dropping Scion unit, has been nerfed as well. As well as that, field ordnance and the Cadian and Kaschan heavy weapons that were being used for mortar teams have gone up a bit. Again, they were a bit unusually good in Bridgehead as well, given that they can have a reroll 1 to hit from that. And also the Deathcore Creed combat engineers, which were getting used, have had their mine made worse, only doing D3 mortal wounds to a bunch of things now, as opposed to the punchy D6 that they had before. Overall, it really does seem that their best attachment has got heavily hit. I certainly rate Astra Militarum losers compared with before, with their strongest attachment getting hit on all fronts. I'm not really sure that they needed both the Scion points increases and also the detachment nerfs. I guess there might be a bit more of a pivot to tanks and Kazakin in transports, either being used in the Hammer of the Emperor or the Combined Regiment. Next up, we've got the Adeptus Mechanicus. It seems like their tournament stats have been sliding a bit over the past few months. Tournament win rates being down at 45% on the lower end of 40k factions in general, which is maybe a little bit surprising given that they'd often been at around about 50% both prior to and after the Grotmus update. In terms of people taking them to grand tournaments, the Halo Screed detachment that supports the entire army fairly well, that's still easily the most played one, followed by Skitarii Hunter cohort, both of them doing okay-ish, but not crazily stand out given the low win rates, and I don't believe they've won any tournaments in a good while. For the updates, they got minimal changes. Belisaria's Call down 15 points, the Tech Priest Dominus down 5. Both of those were already usable, but maybe not standout data sheets that got a fair bit more interesting. Call in particular I think is quite fun for 135 points now between his auras and just having a whole load of raw tankiness and a bit of damage. Realistically, it's not going to change too much for the Admech though, as they're only down 20 points. If you happen to be taking both in an army list, which lots of people weren't, I'd call them very slight winners here, but are more close to being unchanged than anything else. Feels like people aren't managing to have too much good success with them at the moment, still having fairly low play rates, and not a lot of success in the competitive scene. Before we move on to the rest of the Imperium, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Tabletop Stronghold and their magnetic carry cases. These mag cases are made by Sam based in West Virginia in the USA. Basically sturdy MDF boxes with a whole bunch of steel trays in them that you can mount at different levels, and the idea is that you attach magnets to the bases of your miniatures so you can store quite a lot in one space and not have a need for some bulky foam to pad them out or have the risk of them damaging each other. You can certainly DIY magnetic cases, though some people will be happier with purpose-built solutions, and broadly comments and things that I've received about these ones have been very positive indeed, quite liking the quality of the items once they've turned up and finding them useful. As well as magnetic storage cases, they also have a competitive MDF terrain set as well, if you were looking for a board full of ruins, and there's discounts if you pick them up alongside a mag case as well. In any case, thanks to them for sponsoring this one. They'll be linked down in the video description, and they gave me an AT25 code for 25% off if you do happen to pick up anything from them. I'll circle back to them briefly at the end of the video to quickly talk through their range for those interested. Next up, we've got the Adepta Sororitas, and the armies of the Emperor's Faithful definitely feel like they've been the ones that have been struggling the most since the last balance update. Win rates are around about 42% after a rather silly double nerf. Basically Games Workshop having released a really strong codex, upping a bunch of points cost to the point where they were quite well balanced, and then for some reason absolutely doubling down on a huge amount more rules nerfs in December, hitting Bringers of Flame the best attachment in 5 different ways, and then cutting the faction's Miracle Dice generation in half, all alongside a couple more points rises as well. As a result, it doesn't look like too many people have been putting the faction on the table to try and do well in competitive games recently, though the ones that have been giving them a go seem to have been trying to win with Hallowed Martyrs, which did seem like the most obvious go-to, following Bringers of Flame getting nerfed into oblivion. The sister changes definitely felt meaningful and pushed them in the right direction, but at the same time I'm not convinced they're necessarily going to be enough to get them out of one of the lower positions in 40k. Seraphim and Zephyrim dropped down to 85 points per 5 of them. It was more meaningful for Seraphim as they had the unusual tax on big squads due to the Bringers of Flame combo before. Repenter dropped down to 85 points per 5, that makes them a bit more tempting as a trading unit. Arco-Flagellants 140 per 10, Dominions 115 points, again not really needing their points increase given the nerfs to Bringers of Flame, and Celestian Sacrosants got quite a nice points cut as well. 70 points per 5, but only 130 per 10. I feel like they're at the point where 13-point bodies for them look really quite efficient indeed. Finally, they gave them back a few more Miracle Dice. They now generate for every Sisters unit that gets destroyed and not capped at just 1 per phase as it was before, but the previous restriction to just getting 1 per battle round as opposed to 1 per turn still remains, so it's still way less than they had prior to the December update. Overall though, a few more miracles will definitely help, and a bunch of the points changes are interesting enough. At those units, I feel like all the units are interesting enough that they could be put in competitive lists, but maybe aren't getting to the point where they're absolute powerhouses that are just going to be carrying the faction in their own rights. At first impressions, it maybe feels like the Seraphim points changes and maybe the Sacrosanct ones could be some of the most interesting. It'd be interesting to see if a few more people experiment with 10 strong Sacrosanct units. Overall though, I still feel like they probably needed more like this, and my guess is that they'll rise up a bit but still be towards the low end of Warhammer 40k power after those changes. I guess we'll wait and see what people manage to achieve with them. Next up, we've got the Golden Guardians of the Adeptus Custodes. Pre-update, they were in a very strong position in Warhammer 40k, overall win rates of 52%, but again they're one of the armies that had a detachment that was doing unusually well in the Solar Spearhead. Again, one of the strongest attachments in the game per win rates there. Besides that, Shield Host and Talons of the Emperor were both doing fine as well, but not really quite at the same sort of performance level. For the changes, the Custodes had quite a bit go up and down. On the negative side of things, staples like the Blade Champion and Wardens both went up, which isn't the greatest news for them given that they were pretty constant staples in just about every Custodes army list. And then for some direct nerfs to Solar Spearhead, the Venerable Contemptor, Telemon Dreadnought and the Augury Uplink enhancement, they all went up a touch, which certainly takes the edge off that. On the flip side, Custodian Guard dropped 10 points, the Shield Captains are down 10, as are Alea and the Knight Centura. And perhaps most interestingly, they gained the Lines of the Emperor detachment, focusing on big individual units of Custodes fighting solo, and it does have really quite a powerful detachment rule, but also one that means units are really incentivized not to support each other too much, and definitely has some trade-offs against the Shield Host with its powerful options and stratagems there, and a damage boost that can just go off on your Martial Qatar for every unit all the time. Overall, between all that, I'd guess that they'll remain at least fairly similar to where they were, and maybe guess the edge might have been taken off them slightly compared with before. Wardens and Blade Champions did feel like their best units. I guess that at least a few people will pivot towards Custodian Guard, given essentially a 20-point change between the two. And the Solar Spearhead definitely looks a bit less standout if you're spamming Dreadnoughts, having to pay lots of extra copies of that extra 10 points. Will certainly be interesting to see whether Lines of the Emperor takes over as the more popular way to play on foot Custodes though. It definitely does have some trade-offs with Shield Hosts. Overall, I've written slight losers here. I would guess that they'll probably stay at least fairly similar to where they were though. For the Knights of Titan, previously they were looking really quite well balanced. Win rates are around about 50%, though almost entirely using their new Warpbane task force, given the nerfs to the Teleport Assault Force with a 3-inch deep strike stratagem and the Armour of Contempt equivalent that they have. The Grey Knights didn't really get all that many changes in the update. Interceptors down by 5 points, which is handy enough as they're already playable, but not exactly a huge decrease that's really going to change all that much. And there was a nerf to indirect fire purgation squads in Warpbane Task Force. When they're firing when they can't see the opponent, they can't use the big rerolls to hit that they get. That's been limited to only units that you can see. Overall, for power of the faction, I feel like that outweighs the very small decrease to interceptors. I don't think it's the biggest deal in the world for them though. While purgation squads we're definitely seeing playing competitive lists in Warpbane, I feel like they can fairly easily just pivot to something else. I'm not really sure it was a hugely necessary nerf to be honest, given that Grey Knights seemed fairly well balanced, but Games Workshop do seem to keep indirect firepower really quite niche in 10th. For Imperial Knights, it seems like it was broadly pretty positive for them. Pre-update, they were doing it all rather well with some big tournament win rates of around 53% or so. As ever, Knights often tended to do better at small tournaments compared with big ones, though with these sort of win percentages, they'd also taken home a fair few grand tournament trophies over the past few months, maybe a little bit more commonly than they had been previously. The only points change that they got were the Castellan and Valiants dropping down to 480. That seemed interesting and helpful enough. The Castellan I thought was already usable enough. Dropping down a fair bit further certainly doesn't hurt. I feel like the Valiant is still going to remain overshadowed though. I think it just needs to be cheaper versus the Castellan for what it brings to the table ever since Knights were denied Overwatch at the start of 10th. Overall though, one small points drop and Castellan Knights definitely getting a bit more interesting. Certainly isn't going to hurt them. I feel like it's pretty positive for them that they kept their super cheap and efficient armigers. A lot of people have been going a fair bit heavier on the small knights since they went down to 130 points or 140 points each. I guess you could do something like Castellan, Calidus and 10 armigers if you wanted to. In any case, it looks like they're slight winners from this one, and I feel like they look like they're in a particularly strong spot given that they were doing rather well on the whole win rates and things. They only really seem to have got better, and a fair few things at the top end of 40k had got nerfs in one way or another. For the Divergent chapters next, Space Wolves have been winning around about 47% of games, both the Stormlance Task Force and the Champions of Rust doing pretty well. They didn't really get any focal changes. The Space Marine ones are generally going to be nerfs besides the boosted Blade Guard, and you can't use boosted Oath of Moment for Space Wolf detachments that don't take any of their unique units anymore. That's true for all the Divergent chapters. Overall, between the points and the Oath nerf, it does feel like they're slight losers overall. Not really all that big changes, but certainly some Space Wolf lists had used things like Vindicators and Ballistas Dreadnoughts as a bit of fire support, and now that's going to be a little bit less efficient. For the Blood Angels, they've been slightly towards the upper end of Warhammer 40k, win rates for around about 51%, mainly using Liberator Assault Group, though some liked the Angelic Inheritors, and they were certainly one of the chapters where people were making some fairly big use of the boosted Oath of Moment if they didn't take any Blood Angels datasheets, so that certainly feels like a nerf to the top end power level there, even if it didn't really feel very intended. They also got the Space Marine points changes, and a lot of top lists have been using Vindicators, so a slightly unhelpful change for them there. Blood Angels would like the change to Blade Guard though. Only 80 points for them is now looking seriously quite tempting as they hit really quite hard in Blood Angels. And then they got some cuts to Death Company on foot as well. Both flavours of Death Company Marines 85 for 5 or 160 per 10. Overall definitely some pros and cons there. I feel like overall, if anything, they're probably going to come out slightly less powerful compared with before. As mentioned in particular, a lot of people using their sort of Bloodless Angels lists with +1 to wound on Liberator Assault Group being rather fearsome, plus having some good firepower toned down a bit isn't going to help too much either. Cheaper Death Company on foot and Blade Guard might help balance a little bit though. For the Black Templars, they've been doing a fair bit less well in terms of the tournament win statistics, around about 44% wins, most of them using the Righteous Crusaders. They kind of disappointingly had no focal points changes, just had the Space Marine ones, which as mentioned feel more like nerfs than buffs overall. Blade Guard might not hurt for them, but they do have lots of rivals for Black Templars melee. And again, they can't use Boosted Oath in Righteous Crusaders if you take no Templar units if people were doing that. Overall, again, I'd say probably due to the core Space Marine changes being slight losers overall for power. Maybe not the best place for them, given that it seems that they were struggling somewhat previously. I feel like they probably could have done with a few token points cuts to some of their units. Most of their unique stuff is just pointed to the place where it's just a little bit unexciting for the points cost at the moment, even if there's nothing particularly wrong with the datasheets. The Dark Angels had pre-tournament win rates of 48%, largely using Gladius Task Force or Stormlance. Again, they had no specific changes to their unique units, so it's just the generic Space Marine ones which tended to be nerfs more so than buffs. And for their specific detachments, I guess they had a couple of changes. If they're playing Stormlance, they wouldn't be able to target Lionel Johnson with that reactive move stratagem anymore. And I guess in Gladius a buff to fire discipline doesn't hurt, even if the big combo that you used to be able to do with it still isn't possible anymore. Overall, again, due to the firepower nerfs, I'd probably mark them as slight losers. Doesn't feel like too much will really change for them though. I felt like the bigger loss after the balanced data slate for them was getting no help for their unique detachments. Looks like they'll still be remaining as the last Divergent chapter where the majority of competitive army lists tend to run at the core Codex ones in Stormlance and Gladius as opposed to the Dark Angels themed ones. Finally, for the Divergent chapters, we've got the Deathwatch. They were doing really quite well prior to the update, 54% tournament wins and also managing to take down the LVO, seemingly one of 40k's top armies after their index release in December, and they haven't been hurt too much with the Black Spear mission tactics being restricted to just the ones with it printed on the datasheets, so only really helping their unique units. For their changes, their Terminator squad went up 10 points, which I think was fairly predictable. They certainly felt flatly superior to the regular Terminator squad, given that they could get 3 heavy weapons in the unit, and I still feel like they're probably better despite that points increase. An FAQ underlined that you can use adaptive tactics on other Space Marine units to allow them to flex into lethal or sustained hits, which is nice enough. They had the Space Marine firepower nerfs, though maybe Deathwatch armies tended to revolve around their kill teams more anyway. Though interestingly, cheaper Devastator Centurions could actually be genuinely quite interesting for them. They don't need Uriel Ventress to teleport them around the board for 1 command point, and a 6-man squad of Devastator Centurions got 40 points cheaper, so still feels like that could be an interesting option for warping around the board smashing stuff, even if they don't get the mission tactics unless you spend a CP for it. Overall, they seem to have come out of the update rather well. One small nerf to their Terminators, a couple of Space Marine firepower units going up a bit, but broadly maybe feeling at least kind of similar to where they were previously. I suspect they'll still be one of 40k's stronger armies, particularly in the context of a fair few of the strongest attachments getting nerfed. Lastly, for the Imperium, we have the Imperial Agents. Pre-update, their tournament stats are kind of meaningless really. It looks like only around about 20ish people have taken them to grand tournaments in 2025 so far. They're near enough unplayed at a competitive level. The people who have turned up to them have generally done okay with Imperialist fleet board control style lists, but given low player numbers, win rates just aren't ready to be relied on in my opinion for them. For the update, they just didn't really get anything. Their Collector's Assassin went down to 85 points from 100. I guess that one was due to the 3-inch deep strike thing being nerfed, and they had an FAQ regarding Inquisitor and kill team attachment, saying that for the Inquisitor's rules it does apply to the Imperial Agents Deathwatch kill teams, which seems likely anyway. Overall, it's still looking at the moment like Games Workshop isn't really intending to balance them as a normal faction in Warhammer 40k, and just going to keep them as more of a fun and fluff army that occasionally people can do weird board control things with at a competitive level if they want to. The Collector's change maybe feels a bit more relevant for allies compared with elsewhere, though I guess they can be made quite scary in the Assassin detachment for them. Even for allies though, I'd probably still rate the Calidus as the most interesting of them, even if you can do close drop and battle shock things on home objectives with the Collectors. Moving on to Chaos next, and the standard Chaos Space Marines were looking fairly well balanced before. Their win rates have gone up a little bit over the course of the last few months, up to 48%, and have still been one of the factions that have been taking down maybe a slightly disproportionate amount of big tournaments. It seems quite good for them at a top tier competitive level. Big melee damage in Creations of Bile has been the most popular one, then Renegade Raiders and Pact Bound being the next ones, though plenty of others have seen some play as well. For their points changes, the Lord Discordant went down to 160, the Forge Fiend down 10 to 180, and the Predator Annihilator up to 135. Nerdlings are going to be cheaper for them, though don't have quite as good a debuff rule, and a bunch of the other demon datasheets changed a fair bit. Maybe some for better, some for worse if you want some allies. Overall, doesn't really feel like much has changed for them all that much. One gun turret goes up a bit, another one goes down a bit, and the Lord Discordant costs a bit too much. I guess you've also got a new way to play them with Be'lakor, though technically that's a Demons detachment. Overall, still looks like Chaos Space Marines will be fairly well balanced for the average player. They're probably still doing rather well at tops of tournaments if they continue the way that they have been. For the Deity Chaos Legions, they had a few changes, though to be honest they've all got their codexes coming in the very near future, and I'm sure that adding a whole bunch of different detachments and datasheet rewrites is going to change far more than a balance update like this. Death Guard have generally been on the stronger side of Warhammer 40k recently, generally building around their Plague Company with Death Shroud and Typhus, Mortarion usually present, Plague Marines and Rhinos with various support characters, and usually backed up by some fire support. Their main changes were the Predator Destructor going up by 10 points, the Predator Annihilator going up by 5, and Mephitic Blight Haulers going down by 5, so I guess relatively the Little Demon engines gain a little bit on the standard battle tanks. For the Allied Demons there were some changes as well. Nurglings got cheaper but they have a worse damage debuff. Beasts of Nurgle gain Scout, which I think is nice enough for a cheap nuisance unit, and there were some rewrites as well to things like the Great Unclean One and Rottagus for those using those. Overall, I'd probably say that Death Guard are fairly similar. Predators were certainly being used more so than Blight Haulers in competitive lists previously, and the Destructor I think is a slightly painful one to go up to 140. That was just a really quite commonly taken gun turret for them. They definitely have other options though between Wardog Brigands, and I feel like at 85 points the Blight Haulers are genuinely a much more interesting choice, at least fairly interesting for causing some damage to tanks and heavy infantry, and at least fairly durable for the cost now. In any case, with the Codex coming soon, I'm sure that'll change far more than this does, but looks like they'll still be in a good place up to when the Codex comes out. For the World Eaters, they've been pretty well balanced. Tournament win rates are around about 49%, and it seems like the Vessels of Wrath detachment had a fairly positive impact for them. In competitive games, a good amount of people playing both the Berserker Warband and the Vessels of Wrath, and both of them look like they've been doing solidly well, not one necessarily much better than the other. Going for a fairly balanced point, they got a bunch of points drops. The Winged Prince dropped down to 155, the Footprints to 185, and the Juggernaut Lord all the way down to 80. They just got the same Predator increases of 140 for the Destructor and 135 for the Annihilator, not that they tended to be particularly commonly taken datasheets for World Eaters anyway. Overall feels like a small win for them. The changes seem to be particularly helpful for Vessels of Wrath versus the Berserker Warband, so I don't know if that might drive a few more people to run some Demon Princes, or even some random Juggernaut Lords going solo in that. Drops to non-named characters definitely feel like they'll help out that one more though. For the Thousand Sons, it seems like the average person playing with them had been doing okay. Win rates are around about 51%, but also being one of the lowest played factions in the game at the moment. With a few repeated nerfs, they feel like they've got harder to play as an army, and the list builds have been at least fairly cookie cutter for a while now. For their changes, the Mutalith Vortex Beast went up very slightly to 165 points, Predators and Vindicators both went up for them, Scarab Occult Terminators went down, a squad of 5 is now 180 and the Terminator Sorcerer 105, and they also got some points decreases for big squads of Cultists, Zangors and Enlightened, though in general they didn't tend to be units that anyone used in the max size formats, at least not in more optimised lists. Feels like the most meaningful nerf is to the Mutalith, which was taken in quite a lot in competitive lists. I'd say that the best buff is to the Scarab Occult Terminators, which might genuinely be looking at a point where they're kind of interesting at 180, particularly with their character drop shopping as well. It's still really quite a big investment if you did choose to go for a maxed out unit of 10 with a Terminator Sorcerer though. Their firepower units didn't really generally tend to get taken anyway. You could still go for War Dogs allied if you want some raw damage. Again though, they'll have a codex coming soon, which will likely have far more impactful changes than this does. The Emperor's Children maybe aren't massive winners or losers, given that this is just the first set of points for their codex, kind of an interim points cost, so people can get the army on the table right away, but isn't recommended for tournament games until the rest of their release goes live. The points cost were the same as the ones that Games Workshop shared to the content creators, and broadly compared with the codex, the points generally went down by quite a bit. Only a couple of things like Spawn and Rhinos going up a touch, but they are quite interesting versions of those compared with the other Chaos Codexes out there. Overall feels like they've got enough interesting stuff to be strong on the tabletop. Both flavours of their troops seem borderline auto-include, and they do have a solid amount of damage output between multiple different datasheets. Hopefully it won't be too much longer until they actually get their full release and their next wave of models on the tabletop. For Chaos Knights, they were kind of middling on the win rates previously, around about 48%, and as usual with big stat checklists like Knights, they tend to be a bit better at the sort of RTT and casual game kind of level, as opposed to the absolute top ends of competitive play, and do seem to be a fair bit behind their Imperial cousins at the moment, just given their raw efficiency. As ever, the main problem for Chaos Knights is that they're basically just War Dog spam or one big knight if you're feeling daring in competitive play. And for once, it is quite nice to see Games Workshop actually narrow the gap on some of the big knights versus the little guys. The Despoiler and Desecrator both went down to 400 and the Tyrant to 480 to mirror the Loyalist one, and they'll perhaps be the single army that cares the most about the demon changes. Nurglings don't debuff quite as well, but getting them even cheaper is no bad thing. Beasts of Nurgle is really quite nice for Scout as well. Maybe Flamers might get a look in, given they're only 65 points, and nice enough little infantry clearance nuisance units. Maybe the changes to Great Unclean Ones and Rotagus might be downsides though. It felt like they had some trade-offs, and at least a few people were taking Rotagus. Overall though, I certainly mark them as slight winners compared with before. Nice to see the big knights getting a little bit cheaper. I feel like both the Despoiler and Desecrator are interesting datasheets, and both pretty playable as a big knight to go alongside a bunch of War Dogs. I still expect the order of the day being War Dog spam at competitive levels though, and just a 10 or 15 point drop on a 400 point model just isn't really all that meaningful. I feel like they probably could have afforded to be a fair bit more brave with those. Finally for Chaos, the very biggest changes were of course to Chaos Demons, both sort of getting a sort of digital codex update near enough, plus also copying a bunch of nerfs for having the single strongest army in the game previously, which was the Legion of Excess Slanesh detachment. Even with the average from the other detachments thrown in, they still had the best win rate in the game at 56% overall. For the changes, the Legion of Excess got nerfed in a few ways. Their big damage got reined in considerably, the bouncer damage stratagem got a bit worse, and the -1 to hit stratagem side graded a bit. Their index update had a massive amount of changes to datasheets. Fleshhounds returning to reserve is maybe a positive one. Beasts getting scout for no extra points increase was a good one too. Horrors gain the pistol keyword, so at least they can be a bit more annoying damage if they get locked up in combats while they're being disruptive chaff. Bloodletters and Demonettes both lost their inbuilt damage rerolls on their datasheets, though Demonettes and a bunch of Slanesh things gained fights first. Scarbrand can advance and charge. The Great Unclean One now gives an aura of +1 toughness to nearby Nurgle demons, and Shalaxi Hellbane and the Keeper of Secrets both had their Shining Aegis dropped from a 5+ Feel No Pain to just a 3+ armor save, which was quite a lot worse there. There's quite a lot of other changes as well, and they all came hand in hand with a few points changes. The 4+ Feel No Pain Great Unclean One now costs really quite a bit more in the Incursion detachment. Flamers are looking rather good at 65 points, and Screamers are doing fine at 80. And as mentioned, Nurglings dropping down to 35 points per 3 of them again is kind of interesting. Their debuff rule is less disruptive, but that's still an absolutely great placeholder unit that can still do a few positional secondary objectives. Along with all the updates, they also gained Bellacor's Shadow Legion, the allied Chaos Space Marines and Demons detachment that's got some pretty interesting deity-specific buffs, advance and charge for Khorne, and a big melee damage stratagem for them. And Nurgle and Tzeentch units getting a lot tougher, plus they've got some good enhancements. Finally, Karanak and the Slanesh chariots got removed and sent to Legends. They weren't really played all that much in optimised lists, but still sad to see them going away. It didn't really feel like either of them were particularly necessary removals given that they've got current plastic kits. Overall, it's a massive overhaul for them, but I still feel like Demons overall for power level are still in a fairly good place right now. Legion of Excess doesn't look like the strongest detachment in the game anymore, particularly in the context of some of the other Slanesh demon changes, but that's probably a good thing given just how much it was overperforming. It'll be interesting to see what takes over as the next best attachment for them though. Demon Incursion still has some really interesting stuff with its close range deep strikes, though I'm sure there'll be lots of people wanting to put that Shadow Legion on the table with all the fun stuff you can do there. Moving on to Xenos, and first up we have the Aeldari, a pre-update tournament win rates of around 52%, admittedly that just based on a few weeks worth of data, but broadly it had been looking like the Space Elves have been establishing themselves as one of the stronger factions in Warhammer 40k so far. After their detachments, the most commonly played ones were the Devotee of Iniad and Aspect Host and War Host, with the best performing one being the Devoted of Iniad for the Inari. They do have a bunch of fairly crazy tricks allowing them to set up some really big moves, taking Aeldari movement shenanigans to the next level. It seems that Games Workshop had it in their minds that the Eldar were a bit too strong though. The changes that they got were broadly nerfs, the Wave Serpent going up by 10, as did smaller squads of Striking Scorpions. Fire Dragons are 110 points per 5, though to be honest still ridiculously efficient anti-tank even at that cost. Dark Reapers went up 15 for their bigger squad, which maybe seems fair enough as well. I think they'll still be a good unit at 195, though maybe the weirdest change was to Dire Avengers going up 5 points. It didn't really feel like they were particularly too strong outside of Adaman, who they gave their own nerf to with his anti-keyword only going off on a 5+ versus infantry as opposed to a 3+, so not just mowing down entire squads of Custodes or elite infantry anymore. Otherwise, they got a small buff with Corsairs gaining battle focus, though nobody was really taking them so much anyway, and a couple of FAQ clarifications around Inari and Drukhari transports and the rarely played Armoured Warhost. Overall, between all that, it's definitely a nerf, but I feel like it's probably not going to be enough to unseat them as a pretty strong army going forward. In particular, it still seems that the Inari are going to be really quite strong. I feel like it's maybe a bigger nerf to Aspect Host versus the Devoted of Iniad, and might just further underline them as standout strong, particularly in the context of a bunch of other top armies taking some heavy hits. For the Darkkin, they had a sort of middling win rate of around 48% or so. In competitive games, people choosing to play both the Harlequin Allied Reapers Wager and the Sky Splinter Assault Force. The Reapers Wager doing a bit better of the two, though quite a few lists for that take either very minimal or almost no Harlequins. There were minimal changes on the points department, Witches went down to 80 and Cavalite Warriors to 100. Definitely not going to change the world too much, but a very small boost there. Both of those were often played in competitive lists, which is mainly with Lilith, and Cabalite Warriors are quite nice objective grabbers. Overall they feel like slight winners, but aren't going to be massively stronger. For the Tyranids, they were looking rather well balanced previously, with win rates for around about 50%, and doing that with a fair few detachments as well, mainly invasion fleets. The Vanguard Onslaught, Crusher Stampede and Assimilation Swarm were all doing rather well as well. The balanced data slate seems to have tried to help internal balance a little bit, though I feel like the nerfs to their mainline shooting units were a bit painful, Exocrines going up to 140 and Tyrannifexes to 200, and they were units that the vast majority of army lists tended to run, given that they're just the most efficient firepower and best ways to kill tanks and heavy armour and medium infantry out of the army. On the flip side, the Neurolictor dropped down to 80, and that was already a fairly good data sheet, the Trigon down to 140, and the Hive Tyrant dropping from 235 to 225. And again, there were plenty of army lists taking Hive Tyrants at 235. Overall, maybe feels like a slight win for Vanguard versus some of the other detachments. I still probably say that Tyranids might be slight losers out of the update overall though, just given how commonly played the Exocrines and Tyrannifexes are, and they don't really have good rivals to replace them all that much. I feel like both of their units are still really quite solid at their new slightly higher points cost. Genestealer Cults didn't really get too much. Pre-update, their tournament win rates were around 50%, so fairly nicely balanced there. Their detachments of choice after the big December updates they had, with the Resurgence tokens and things, seem to have been Biosantic Brood Surge, Host of Ascension and Final Day. Final Day being the Allied Tyranid one where they can take Vanguard organisms along there, and that one seems to have been doing the best for overall wins so far for them. For the balance changes, they didn't really get much. 20 strong Neophyte Hybrid squads went up 15 points to 145, which is slightly painful. They were quite an efficient damage dealer unit with certain combos, perhaps with a Primus with an enhancement or a Benefactus depending on the detachment, and out of those first three maybe it hurts the Host of Ascension more so than Biosanctic Brood Surge or Final Day. It's not the biggest change in the world, but I feel like 20 strong Neophyte blocks would probably want a character with some sort of specific enhancements to make them even shootier if you are going to fill them at 145 points. The leagues of Votann were on win rates around about 50%, so looking rather well balanced there. Their army rule was switched around slightly, basically meaning that the Oath Band was fairly similar, but you now get 2 Double Judgment marked units for other detachments as well. The only other one that we have right now is the Half Band. I guess that's a relative win for that one, but given that literally no one seemed to be playing it in competitive games at all, it seems there's a good chance that won't be enough to actually make it compete with the Oath Band and a bit more flexibility with the stratagems helping out more units. Maybe it might encourage a few more people to try that one though. For the Orks, it maybe feels like they might have been the very biggest winners of the balance updates, at least in terms of the strength of their strongest build. Previously their win rates were around about 50% or so. Tactical Brigade was the standout detachment for them, both seeing the most play and also easily the most top tournament success as well. Warhorde following that, and then others like Bully Boys, Dread Mob and Green Tide seeing some play as well. Weirdly, it seems that Games Workshop has basically handed out really quite big nerfs to the Tactical Brigade, but then given them a shooting detachment that if anything seems even better, so a bit of an odd switch around there. Tank Busters went up to 135 points, and that will be felt by a few detachments, as quite a lot of armies were just using them for their raw strength alone. The Shock Attack Gun Mech went up to 75 points, not the best datasheet unless you've got a specific detachment to use him in, but is fairly good in Tactical Brigade and Dread Mob. And then the Tactical Brigade was nerfed in its own right, the core rule meaning that you can only get one tactic, not two, and even that one tactic now comes with a chance of taking a mortal wound, and they also include Mech Captain enhancement to help out Flash Kit. That's now a big 45 points rather than 30. Though I still think it's overall worth it. To make sure that shooty Orks weren't feeling too bad about themselves though, Games Workshop gave them the rather Bad Moon themed Mordaka detachment, and this one's just kind of obscene with the sheer damage buffs it gives to certain Orky shooting. Sustained hits 2 on everything that an infantry model or walker fires with, meaning that tank busters are just still ridiculously scary here, as is just about everything else that triggers the rule, maybe looters in particular. And then on top of that, their support options are still great. The biggest and best one is a 1 command point stratagem to put a unit in the war each turn, which just gives you crazy amounts of stuff between advance and charge, extra attacks, extra strength, advance and shoot in this detachment, and an invulnerable save before you even get into datasheet relevant stuff. Feels like that could be a very tempting one to put on Mega Knobs, potentially with Ghazghkull Thraka as well, just as a massive melee Death Star that's easily worth it for the 1 command point spend. Otherwise they've got good command points for more shooting buffs as well, and a nice melee wound rerolls one just in case the shooting detachment didn't do melee well enough. Barring any surprises, at first impressions it feels like Orks probably have the single strongest detachment in the game now, and it turns out that Daka was only really getting started with the Tactical Brigade. Overall for the top build strength, Orks playing more Daka look like really big winners. Other detachments losing out a bit more, particularly the Tactical Brigade given focal nerfs. I guess that the predicted reign of terror for Mordaka won't last all that long though, probably just till the next balance update, until something swings back, and I guess would probably nerf or limit the core detachment rule in some way. Orks definitely could be the army to beat though. The Necrons were also sitting towards the top of Warhammer 40k, with slightly above average win rates of 52%, Star Shatter Arsenal being the most played for them. Plenty of top tournament placings for that one, and then Awakened and Hypercrypt also doing well as other detachments. Games Workshop seem to have shown at least a little bit of restraint with them though. The Doomsday Arc going up to 200 points from 190, where it's still going to be a very effective unit at that points cost. It was 200 points before, and people were running it a lot in Hypercrypt. Maybe that one change might have other detachments gain slightly on the Star Shatter, where it's a really focal unit for that with all the stratagem access that it has. But otherwise no enormous changes for the Necrons. Slight losers overall due to one good datasheet going up, but they still look like they'll be very strong. Finally for the Tau Empire, by the numbers they hadn't been doing quite so well. Win rates are around about 46%, so a little bit towards the lower end of Warhammer 40k, and perhaps a fairly impressively even split between a bunch of the detachments. Lots of people playing Montcar Kauyon, Auxiliary Cadre and Retaliation Cadre. For their points updates, Krutox Rampagers went down to 85 points from 95, and at that cost they are looking like really quite an efficient unit for the sheer stats that they have. They're certainly looking like even better focal units for the Hunting Pack and the Auxiliary Cadre, where their damage output can be dialed up to really quite significant amounts. The Lone Spear is quite a nice cheap lone operative supporting piece now. Otherwise, the new detachment that they got is called the Experimental Prototype Cadre. This one adds a 6-inch range to all their weapons on the board. They have 2 solid damage buff stratagems and a couple of durability boosting ones, and then a bunch of enhancements that can amp up various weapons for Crisis Commanders. The Fusion Blaster and Plasma Rifle ones are both looking rather punchy. Overall, it's broadly all changes in the right direction, though maybe a little bit more limited to certain units and builds. The cheaper Rampagers feel really quite nice for the Auxiliary Cadre. I'm a bit uncertain as to how tempted people will be by the new detachment. It definitely does have useful rules, but at early impressions I'm not really convinced it adds all that much more in terms of utility versus say Montcar Kauyon and Retaliation. They generally have some pretty interesting combos of extra damage and extra mobility, maybe seeming kind of similar added value to the extra range, firepower and durability strats that the Experimental Cadre seems to help with. Hopefully some people do manage to make it work to good effect though. Overall, for initial impressions of winners and losers from the balance update, as often seems to be the case for Games Workshop, I feel like they've broadly done more good stuff than bad. A lot of the stronger detachments in the game have caught nerfs in one way or another, and some of the lower ranking armies have got some help, and the new detachments they added into the game feel pretty good fun. Seems like a few factions have done rather well out of the changes. Orks with more Daka, Aeldari with their Inari detachment, Deathwatch didn't get hurt too much, Necrons still seem pretty fine, and Imperial Knights, despite being on a fairly good win rate, were untouched. I guess most of these might be doing rather well. Maybe armies that have been notably toned down. Space Marine top list from before look like they're being hit, both for Ultramarines Ironstorm style builds plus Vanguard Spearhead. I still feel like they'll be very playable with Guilliman on the field though. Guard Bridgehead definitely caught some big nerfs, as did Demons with the Legion of Excess and Custodes with Solar Spearhead. And for some armies like Blood Angels, their boosted Oath but Divergent Detachment armies just no longer really exist. For criticisms, I feel like they probably could have done a bit more for the Sisters of Battle. I'd guess that the points changes and Miracle Dice change that they gave them might be enough to have them limp into some of the lower tier armies rather than being notably below, but still overall not in the best place. Feels like Black Templars could have probably done with a little bit of focal help themselves as well. I guess we'll see if theory crafting it matches up with in practice, but it certainly feels like the Mordaka detachment is one of the strongest attachments in Warhammer 40k, which probably wasn't Games Workshop's intent. I feel like they'll probably wind up addressing that with reactionary nerfs. In any case though, look forward to hearing your thoughts. Let me know how you feel your factions have fared in the balance updates down in the comments. Finally, I'll just round off by cycling back to the video sponsor and Tabletop Stronghold. As mentioned before, they're one option for some custom built magnetic carry cases to get your figures from A to B in safety. Here's how many miniatures that you can fit on one tray, around about 90 25mm bases or 30 odd Terminators. And then the different cases basically have different amount of layers of those same trays. This mini one's the more skirmish scale one, that can still fit some big tanks like the Spartan down there. The regular mag case is quite a lot taller. This one's £114 or $120 while using that AT25 code that they gave me. I'll leave the internal dimensions on the screen. You can see there's enough room for a big Chaos Knight at the bottom though. And then they have the really big one, which is basically putting two of them together for a very mighty collection indeed. Finally, they do have their MDF competitive terrain set as well. This one's around about £110 or $120 if using the discount code. In general, shipping of these is free to much of the world, though there might be some VAT or import duties to pay. In any case, a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. You can check them out, links down in the video description if you'd like to take a look at their stuff. I'll leave this one there for now though. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the 40k videos coming. And check out the channel's Patreon page if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons get a few rewards such as seeing occasional videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry to the prize giveaways and things. A big thank you to anyone supporting on there. In any case though, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.